on a challenging descent in the Himalayas.
Landing on runway 02. Questions or concerns?
No questions, no concerns, Commander.
A passenger jet collides with the side of a mountain.
What's happening? No!
It really was a shocking moment.
But when their most vital piece of evidence doesn't deliver...
This is it?
Investigators scramble for answers.
Could be weather, loss of thrust, intruder in the cockpit.
But the accidental discovery of a valuable clue
Could it be?
points to the origins of what went wrong.
Come on, come on, come on!
That was the eureka moment in this investigation.
Pakistan International Airlines Flight 268 is en route to Kathmandu, the capital of Nepal. The 2.5-hour flight from Karachi is one of the few that flies to the Nepali capital, situated 4,600 feet above sea level. Landlocked between China and India, Nepal is home to 8 of the world's 10 tallest peaks, including the mighty Everest. Kathmandu is a favorite destination for travelers to the Himalayas, many of whom are making their way to Nepal for the start of the popular trekking season.
Could I have a tea, please?
Among them are Mick Hardwick and his friend Dave Harries, both mountaineering instructors back home in Britain.
Thank you. I climbed with them to the Alps. They were certainly very, very good climbers at a variety of different disciplines in alpine work, really top of the tree.
They're on their way to climb Annapurna, the 10th highest mountain in the world.
Annapurna was certainly an ambitious program, but it wasn't foolhardy. It was well thought out and well planned. It would have been a huge moment for them. It would have been a trip of a lifetime.
In the distance, they get their first look at the Himalayas.
Hey, have a look at that. Ah, finally.
On the flight deck, Captain Iftikhar Janjua is in command. He's a former officer in the Pakistani Air Force, who's now a senior pilot instructor with the airline. Captain Mohammed Hussain flew around the world with Captain Janjua on many different flights.
I knew him for a period of about 5 years. He had no airs about him, you know, he was quite a simple person. He was a family man. He never smoked, he didn't drink. That way he was a straight guy.
I don't like the look of the clouds ahead.
The first officer is Hassan Akhtar, a junior pilot with the airline, with almost 1,500 hours flying the Airbus A300.
How about we divert around them?
Yes, Commander. Agreed.
It's nearing the end of monsoon season. Large storms are still frequent along the route.
Kathmandu, Pakistan 268. We are 10 to 15 miles right of the track to avoid a build-up en route.
To avoid the storm, Captain Janjua notifies Kathmandu Air Traffic Control of his change to Flight 268's approach.
Roger, 10 to 15 miles right of track. Copied.
Could get bumpy. Let's keep them seated.
Agreed, Commander. Fasten seatbelt sign is on.
We're about to begin our descent into Kathmandu. We are entering an area of turbulence, and I request all of you to remain seated.
The descent is always quite scary because the plane seems to be descending forever. You sort of lose track of where you actually are.
We're expecting it to be a little choppy.
Well, here comes the mountains.
Then you're on the runway, and it's always a relief when the plane comes to a halt.
I'll take over from here, Akhtar.
Yes, Commander.
I have control.
You have control?
The first officer hands over control of the aircraft to the captain. Flight 268 leaves its cruising altitude as it begins the approach into Kathmandu. In 1992, Kathmandu Airport doesn't use radar to track its planes. Every movement, planned or otherwise, must be accurately reported by the flight crew.
In the absence of radar, it requires good communication between the aircraft and the air traffic controller. They have to communicate very carefully.
Pakistan 268 approaching overhead. Simran 150.
Pakistan 268, descend to 11,500. No delay expected.
Roger, sir.
Down to 11,500.
The problem with Kathmandu is that you have a range of mountains to the south that you have to get over, and then you have to drop down quite steeply in order to be able to land at the threshold of the runway. There is a danger of arriving at the threshold too fast or even a little bit high.
The mountains surrounding Kathmandu require pilots to make what's known as a stepped approach. Pilots must descend to a series of lower altitudes at certain distances from the airport.
We can expect descent clearance by 16 miles. Descent angle is steep, so we need to be at flaps 15 by 16 miles. Landing on runway 02. Watch for stray animal and birds. Questions or concerns?
No questions, no concerns, Commander.
Pakistan 268 report 16 miles, wind 180. Expect Sierra approach.
Roger, call you at 16 miles, expecting Sierra approach. Sierra approach, Commander.
Here it is. Watch my levels.
The details of the stepped approach are laid out on a chart for the pilots.
The approach chart is designed to keep you clear of terrain, so you have to follow the approach chart.
As Flight 268 begins its final approach towards Kathmandu, passengers and crew prepare for landing.
Well, sun and blue skies would be nice.
Alpha Charlie Hotel, surface wind 20005.
Pakistan 268 is at 16 miles, 11,500.
16 miles from the airport, the pilots report their altitude as 11,500 feet.
Roger, Pakistan 268.
Report 10 miles.
Roger, call you at 10 miles, Pakistan 268.
The crew works its way through the steps towards Kathmandu, approaching from the south. They should be touching down in about 6 minutes.
Alpha Charlie Hotel, continue to taxiway number 2.
Pakistan 268 is at 10 miles.
Report your level. We crossed out of 8,500. 200 now.
Roger, clear for final. Report 4 miles, runway 02.
We'll call you at 4 miles, Pakistan 268. Clear for final, runway 02.
Runway 02.
Flight 268 is now less than 10 miles from the runway. Air traffic control waits for the flight crew's next position report. Three minutes go by. Flight 268 should have reported that they've reached the next step by now.
Pakistan 268, report position. Pakistan 268, report position. Pakistan 268, tower. Pakistan 268, this is tower.
As the minutes tick by, air traffic controllers come to a horrifying realization. Flight 268 is missing somewhere in the Himalayas. It doesn't take much time for Kathmandu air traffic controllers to get word that PIA Flight 268 has crashed somewhere in the Himalayas. Within hours, the plane's wreckage is found on the side of a mountain. The flight was carrying more than 20 tons of fuel. And the plane is completely consumed by fire. All 167 people on board have died.
Tonight, investigators refuse to speculate on possible causes of the crash. So dangerous are the conditions.
We're all back in North Wales, and the news filtered through into the office. We just sort of stared in disbelief, really. We could believe it. You hear of these things happening, but when it happens to people you've been in contact with on a daily basis, year in, year out, and worked with on the cliffs and the crags, it's just disbelief.
As the flames die down, Nepal faces a chilling reality. A passenger jet has crashed near the Kathmandu runway for the second time in 2 months. The first was a Thai Airways Airbus with 113 people on board. Canadian accident investigator Dave McNair is already in Nepal leading the Thai Airways investigation.
There hadn't been an accident in Kathmandu for many, many years. There was the one accident that happened back in July, and then a second accident of a major aircraft at the same place, and it really was a shocking moment.
Yeah.
Within hours, the Nepalese government launches an investigation into the crash of Flight 268.
We need to get there as soon as the weather clears.
Already stretched thin by the Thai Airways investigation, the Nepalese ask British investigators for help.
Thanks for coming, Andrew.
Andrew Robinson from Britain's Air Accidents Investigation Branch is one of the investigators assigned to the case.
Let's see what we're dealing with here.
My role in the investigation was to look at the engineering aspects of the accident. So I would be looking at the site, the wreckage distribution, the wreckage itself, the components within it, and trying to work out what the impact attitude was, whether all the aircraft was present at the impact site, that sort of thing.
Kathmandu Airport is the main hub of Nepal's tourist industry. The pressure is on the team to figure out what caused this accident as quickly as possible.
We wanted to find out, obviously, if there was something wrong with Kathmandu Airport or procedures involved in approaching or landing at it. So, yes, there was a huge concern within the aviating community.
The Nepalese government deploys the military to help investigators get to the remote crash site, which is more than 7,000 feet above sea level.
I was part of the team to go up there to look at the initial wreckage survey. It was quite of a perilous drive to get there. We got to the base camp, and then we had to walk about 2 kilometers up a path to get to the site. It was an emotional walk because as we're walking up, people are bringing the remains down. When we first encountered the wreckage site, you couldn't even recognize an airplane except for the tail. And of course, you could see some of the souvenirs of people had were lying on the ground. A little child's sock was there. So, you know, that related to the people who were on the airplane. But in this case, it was just the aircraft was just totally destroyed. It was just complete obliteration of the aircraft.
The team begins examining the wreckage. But conditions are treacherous.
The aircraft had crashed into the side of a mountain about 150 feet from the top. And getting about on the site to inspect it was actually quite difficult because the average slope was about 45 degrees.
Investigators quickly conclude that it's too dangerous to examine the wreckage on site.
The actual workers were Nepalese who had to deal with some steep slopes and had to work very, very carefully to make sure nobody was injured on the site.
As the investigation gets underway, one thing is obvious: Flight 268's final altitude.
This is the location of the crash site, 9 miles south of the airport. The aircraft collided with the mountain at an elevation of 7,280 feet.
Investigators plot the location and altitude of the crash site.
Just below the summit.
Where should they have been?
Can you pass me that approach chart, please? Thank you. At 10 miles out, he should have been at 8,200 feet.
How do you hit a mountain you're supposed to clear by 1,000 feet?
You know it hit the mountain, there's no doubt about that. but you don't know why it was as low as it was when it hit the mountain.
As yet more mystery swirls around Flight 268, a makeshift morgue is set up outside the airport. The people of Kathmandu must come to terms with a second tragedy in as many months, and pressure builds to find out why that happened. Nepalese soldiers have retrieved the aircraft's black boxes from the wreckage of PIA Flight 268.
Put that over there, please.
The Digital Flight Data Recorder, or DFDR, contains information about critical aircraft operations and performance.
They look pretty banged up.
The cockpit voice recorder records conversations between the pilots. They'll both be sent to France, where the data will be downloaded and analyzed.
Flight recorders are extremely vital to investigations. The most important part is it really brings you closer to understanding the entire reason for the accident.
But until they get the data, investigators must look elsewhere for clues. They hope the air traffic controller can provide some insight.
I've been running through every conversation we had and studying my notes.
Does anything stand out?
They had to deviate around some bad weather.
Kathmandu, Pakistan 268. We are 10 to 15 miles
right of the track to avoid a buildup en route.
The controller tells investigators that the crew reported some storm clouds on the way to Kathmandu.
It's usually very hazy in the Kathmandu Valley. In most conditions, when you've got mountains, you invariably have clouds.
That's common this time of year.
Anything else after that?
Standard position reports by the book.
Pakistan 268 is at 10 miles.
Report your level.
We crossed out of 8,500. 200 now.
Roger. Clear for final. Report 4 miles. Runway 02.
We'll call you at 4 miles, Pakistan 268.
He said he'd contact me when he got 4 miles out. But I never heard from him after that.
Okay, let's see what the wreckage can tell us.
When an aircraft is destroyed, there are still things you can get from the accident site.
Investigators consider the possibility the jet was flying out of control when it crashed. They scrutinize the crash site for clues.
Look at this. The right wing impacts up here.
A large scar shows Robinson precisely where the wings hit the side of the mountain. He also notices that just 1.3 meters below the impact scar, the top of a tree has been cut cleanly.
The wing couldn't have cut that tree. So what did?
The aircraft cut some tree branches, so you can actually use that to measure angles of impact. Then you can use other evidence to find out what happened to the airplane.
What about the flaps? Fully extended, exactly 1.3 meters below the wing.
For the team, it's a critical clue. As the Airbus A300 slows for landing, its wing flaps extend by as much as 25 degrees. Hanging below the wings, the extended flaps would shave the top of the tree as it slams into the mountain.
Wings level, no pitch down, flaps extended.
In other words, the exact landing configuration.
This plane was absolutely not out of control.
Flaps 10.
Flaps 10.
This is an indication that, in fact, the crew was deliberately flying it there. But what was abnormal was the fact the airplane was being flown too low. The question is, why was that?
To answer that question, the team creates a list of every conceivable scenario based on the evidence they've collected so far.
Any thoughts?
Loss of thrust?
Clear for final, runway
02.
Runway 02.
Loss of engine number 1. We're losing number 2 as well.
Investigators consider a loss of thrust in both engines.
Okay, watch my altitude. Come on, come on, come on!
7,800.
Initiate restart, either engine.
And a rapid loss of altitude,
7,500. We're not gonna make it.
leading to the collision with the mountain. Robinson studies what's left of the plane's engines.
Only one way this got in so deep.
The damage and debris inside tell Robinson the fan blades were spinning when they hit the ground. And further examination of the device that controls fuel flow shows they were at the lowest thrust setting, flight idle. That's precisely where they should be for an A300 descending towards the runway.
The thrust from the engines was symmetrical and at low power. There was no indication of loss of control, so that was dismissed. So we then had to sit down and think of reasons why the pilot might have been too low.
With mechanical failure ruled out.
Okay, not the engines.
And the black box data still in Paris.
What else?
Investigators turned their attention to what was happening in the cockpit. Robert Bohr is an aviation psychologist who has studied the course of this investigation.
Accident investigators will typically approach this kind of investigation as though they were detectives, and they're going to raise a wide range of questions, hypotheses that they will want to test out.
Okay, what about an intruder in the cockpit?
Unlawful interference is something that's around us. It's everywhere. We spend our lives dealing with it every time we check into the airport. So we know it's out there.
The team now wonders, were the 167 people on board victims of a terrorist attack? Investigators are concerned an act of terrorism may have brought PIA Flight 268 to a violent end in the Himalayas. Pakistan International Airlines has been on high alert for over a decade, since one of its planes was hijacked for 13 days in 1981. As a result, the airline routinely places armed guards on high-risk routes.
There were 4 air guards on this flight.
They turn to the passenger manifest for more information.
Here, 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 and here.
As often happened in Pakistan Airways flights, there were a number of security guards on board, which would probably tend to suppress unlawful interference.
The controller reported that the first officer's final radio call, just 32 seconds before impact, was calm and professional.
We'll call you at 4 miles, Pakistan 268.
No hint of a struggle.
That helps us to understand that on the flight deck, things were pretty normal. The crew were probably therefore not being interfered with by a hijacker.
I think we can rule out an intruder. Now what?
Could be weather.
In Kathmandu, there quite often build up some clouds, and they can develop into thunderstorms or cumulonimbus types clouds. And the suspicion was maybe there was some sort of cloud like that on the approach.
This is everything from the time of the accident.
Investigators examine weather conditions throughout the flight. The report was cloudy with a potential for storms. But because the crew had deviated around bad weather,
Kathmandu, Pakistan 268. We are 10 to 15 miles right of track to avoid a buildup en route.
it's unlikely they then flew into a thunderstorm. By now, the team has ruled out all possible external factors for this accident.
Flaps were out, engines spinning, no intruder, no serious weather on approach.
They're left with only one conclusion.
He must not have known that they were flying too low.
Clear for finals, runway 02.
Runway 02.
Next altitude is 6,800 at 8 miles. Now crossing through 7,500, 7,400.
What's happening? No!
It's clear in this situation that the pilots have built up a picture of the outside world that is not true and accurate, which leads to the crash. However, we have to ask questions why that may be.
Investigators look into two possibilities for the flight's dangerously low altitude.
Either they ignored their chart and were doing a visual approach, or they somehow misread the chart.
Nothing else makes sense.
We had no way of knowing why it was too low. So that became a matter of studying the data and having a general roundtable discussion.
All right, let's start with the visual approach.
Roger, Pakistan 268, report 10 miles.
Roger, call you at 10 miles, Pakistan 268.
We can save some time by going visual. Watch my speed. We should soon see the runway.
On a visual approach, pilots fly based almost entirely on what they can see.
Yes, Commander. Visual to runway 02.
Rather than a predetermined route.
Flaps 10.
Flaps 10.
Flaps 15.
Flaps 15.
In many instances, visual landings are easier for pilots.
Watch for the runway.
But with a greater risk of human error.
What's happening? No!
It's possible, but almost total cloud coverage throughout the entire approach. Plus, they knew the terrain. The captain made this approach at least 7 times. The first officer 5.
Investigators conclude it's highly unlikely the flight crew attempted a visual approach in thick clouds.
It's a complicated arrival. It requires a step down at various points toward the runway threshold. And perhaps most significantly, the meteorological conditions were not conducive to a visual approach.
Pakistan 268, report 16 miles.
The only theory left is that the pilots somehow misinterpreted their approach chart.
Sierra approach, Commander.
Here it is. Watch my levels.
Everything was working technically. There didn't appear to be any interference on the flight deck by anyone. And so the only conclusion that we can take from this is that for some reason, the pilots had clearly misinterpreted data.
All right, let's look at this.
Investigators hope the flight's black box data, back from Paris, will help solve the mystery. They look at the plane's flight path as the crew prepares for landing.
They started their descent. At 16 miles out, they're at 10,500 feet. Then down to 9,500 at 13 miles. 8,200 at 10 miles. Then quickly down to 7,500 until impact at 7,280.
The data reveals an astonishing fact.
So, 1,000 feet too low, right from the get-go.
The approach to Kathmandu is one of the last places on Earth a pilot would risk flying too low.
Wait a minute. There you go. Perfect match. They were flying the approach, but one step ahead.
What the aircraft flew was pretty much what the chart said, except that the pilot had got one step ahead of himself. So he's flying the correct altitude for the next position, which was a sort of eureka moment, I think, in this investigation.
He's adjusting his descent to hit the lower altitudes. It's no accident.
We obviously started to wonder why this should be the case.
Still working in the shadow of the Thai Airways crash just 2 months earlier.
Are we ready? Let's hear it.
Investigators now hope the Pakistan Airways cockpit voice recording will shed light on what happened in the cockpit in the lead-up to the fatal collision. But as the team begins listening to the CVR, they get a gut-wrenching shock.
This is it.
The cockpit voice recording of PIA Flight 268 is playing the last thing investigators want to hear. Silence. But then...
We are entering an area of turbulence, and I request all of you to remain seated.
The tape has recorded the announcements made to the cabin and conversations with controllers, but not the conversations between the two pilots.
Okay, so nothing from the cockpit mic.
It's a major setback.
Back to the drawing board.
Without the full cockpit voice recording, investigators need to find other ways of understanding why the pilots of Flight 268 were flying 1,000 feet too low at every step of their approach.
We have to therefore build a picture of what might have been going on in their minds, in the relationship between the two pilots, and in their relationship between themselves, the physical environment, and air traffic control.
What if the problem is the actual approach chart itself?
To avoid the mountains surrounding Kathmandu, pilots follow an approach chart about the size of a large postcard. It provides the specific altitudes pilots must take at set distances from the airport. They study the same chart used by the flight crew.
So is, let's say, 8,200 feet the right altitude for 10 miles or 8 miles? It's hard to say.
Even harder when it's actual size.
The operations team spent a lot of time looking at a chart that the crew had been using. They concluded that there was a large amount of information on it. It was a lot of clutter.
Investigators need to know how the crew would have prepared themselves for the complicated approach. They examine the cockpit layout of an identical Pakistan International Airlines Airbus A300.
There's no place to clip an approach chart here.
Most aircraft have little clips on the control column to attach the approach plates to. Now, this particular aircraft didn't.
There is just here. Now only the captain can see it, and he'd have to keep turning his head. Unlikely they use that. More likely he put it here.
The other clip is a full 3 feet away from either pilot.
That's not much better. It's almost impossible to read, and that handle is blocking the descent profile.
They learned that Pakistan International Airlines has only 2 places for pilots to clip their charts. Both positions make it very difficult to read a 4-inch wide piece of paper.
It's difficult to make a quick reference if you're having to sort of look to the right or to the left for a chart.
Could it be?
Then, quite by accident, the investigators discover a key clue regarding the pilot's misreading of the approach chart.
If you pick up the chart and happen to put your thumb over the 11,500 foot mark for 16 nautical mile marker, in that case, it might have guided his eye to the next height fix, and he might have assumed that that was the correct height for the 16-mile marker point.
This definitely makes it look like 10,500 is the correct altitude at 16 miles.
Robinson finally has a theory he can put to the test.
Kathmandu Tower, good afternoon. Pakistan 268, 25 miles at 11,500.
Just a few minutes before impact, the first officer reports being 25 miles from the airport at the correct altitude of 11,500 feet.
Pakistan 268, report 16 miles, wind 180, expect Sierra approach.
Roger, call you at 16 miles, expecting Sierra approach. Sierra approach, Commander.
But when the captain looks at the approach chart, his thumb may have obscured the correct next altitude.
Here it is. Watch my levels.
Now, instead of maintaining 11,500 feet, Captain Janjua dials in the next altitude on the chart.
Descending to 10,500.
Oblivious that his plane's approach is now 1 step ahead. The crew has now made a fatal mistake, unaware the airliner is now descending towards a violent collision with the side of a mountain.
So that was where it all started.
Investigators now pursue the new theory that the pilots of Flight 268 misread the altitudes on a cluttered approach chart.
At 16 miles, they should be at 11,500, but they've descended to 10,500.
The team has a surprising realization.
But then they report being at 11,500.
At the 16-mile mark, the first officer reports the altitude they should be at, 11,500 feet.
Pakistan 268 is at 16 miles, 11,500.
Instead of 10,500, the lower altitude they're actually at. The investigators have uncovered a new mystery. that goes right to the heart of what went so horribly wrong.
Why did they descend to 10,500 and then report being at 11,500?
Andrew Robinson's team returns to the flight data, hoping to understand why the pilots of Flight 268 misread and misreported their approach altitudes before the crash.
A slat extension, a frequency change, and then flaps and landing gear.
He was a busy guy.
It's a fast and steep approach, and unless you're a pilot with considerable experience flying this route, maybe several times in a week, it's going to be very testing.
Descending to 10,500. Initiating descent.
Investigators now believe that as the distracted flight crew approached 16 miles,
throttles to flight idle, slats 15.
Their attention was consumed by the demands of the busy descent.
Flaps 10.
Flaps 10.
Flaps 15. Landing gear down.
By now, the captain has already dialed the flight's descent 1,000 feet too low.
Gear down, 3 green.
We're at 16, report our position.
Pakistan 268 is at 16 miles.
Investigators think the first officer hastily misreports the altitude on the approach chart
11,500.
without double-checking his altimeter. Then, Captain Janjua is too busy to notice the discrepancy between the reported and actual altitudes.
In quite a stressful environment, such as the arrival at this airport, the build-up of pressure inside the pilot must be quite considerable. And their capacity to assimilate, take in information, read what's going on around is going to be severely taxed.
Can we hear his next report, please?
Pakistan 268 is at 10 miles. Report your level. We crossed out of 8,500. 200 now.
When he makes this report, he's at 8,100 feet.
We crossed out of 8,500. 200 now.
Roger, clear for final. Report 4 miles, runway.
Both pilots seem to have made mistakes, but air traffic control could have caught them and sounded the alarm.
Why did the air traffic controllers not speak up? Why did they not say anything?
Investigators head to Kathmandu Airport to find out why air traffic controllers didn't warn Flight 268 it was flying too low before it crashed.
I did not know his exact position, so I had no way of knowing what the terrain below him was.
In this case, without radar, it's really the responsibility of the crew to make sure of where they're flying and their approach.
They also learned that pilots flying into Kathmandu often reported being at altitudes lower than the ones specified on the chart.
When the mountaintops are covered in clouds, pilots will sometimes dip under them and fly over this valley instead.
We crossed out of 8,500. 200 now.
If the pilots of Flight 268 had detoured around the mountain, 8,200 feet would be a safe altitude.
Radar coverage in this area was not well developed, and therefore it was very much a procedural approach and not one that relied on inputs from the air traffic controllers themselves. They were recipients of information and not really guiding the aircraft in.
It all starts with the initial misreading of the chart and spirals forward from there.
Investigators believe they've finally developed an explanation for how the tragic accident unfolded.
Sierra approach, Commander.
The first mistake is made before the 16-mile marker, where the captain likely misreads the approach chart.
Here it is. Watch my levels.
And enters the altitude for the 13-mile marker, one step ahead.
Descending to 10,500. Landing gear down.
Gear down, 3 green.
We're at 16, report our position.
Then, likely distracted by the busy approach, the first officer misreports their altitude.
Pakistan 268 is at 16 miles.
He reports where they should have been.
11,500.
Not where they actually are. Investigators believe that if the captain had caught and checked that discrepancy, the flight's outcome might have been completely different.
At that point, there was scope to correct and get back on track. but the profile suggests that they thought they were on the correct altitude and everything stemmed from there. So they carried on being that one step ahead.
Flight 268 remains 1,000 feet below the recommended safe altitude for what's left of its fatal descent.
We crossed out of 8,500. 200 now. Next altitude, 6,800 at 8 miles. Now crossing through 7,500, 7,400.
3 minutes after they first misread the chart, they impact the ground.
What is quite striking is it is a very difficult approach, and in spite of that, the pilots are actually operating effectively, but not safely. This is at the heart of crew resource management, and that has failed in this accident.
In the end, if the plane had been just a few hundred feet higher, it would have missed the mountain and 167 lives would have been spared. In the aftermath of the Flight 268 tragedy, investigators make a number of recommendations to prevent another accident due to a misread approach chart. Chief among them is simplifying the Sierra approach itself to make it less complex and challenging. They also recommend installing air traffic radar at Kathmandu and suggest Pakistan International Airlines install clips on the control columns of all its A300 airplanes.
Minor things like the provision of chart clips, installation of radar, it's a gradually improving picture, and things hopefully still will continue to improve.
A memorial to the victims of Flight 268 stands at the foot of the mountain where it crashed.
They're still remembered by people of my generation. They're still remembered as people who did a lot and would have done a lot more in the world of mountain training.